All right, well, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I'm William Anthony Hay, Interim Director of the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership here at Arizona State University, and I'm very glad you can join us for this event in the school's Civic Discourse Project. Our theme this year is Civics, Patriotism, and America's Prospects. And today's speaker, Roosevelt Monta, talking with us about great books and liberal education, addresses a very important aspect of civic life. Now, this is the school's 7th year organizing the Civic Discourse Project for ASU and for the Phoenix community and national audiences. We're very glad to continue our collaboration with Arizona PBS for another season of recording the Civic Discourse Project events. They archive all of our events on their website and broadcast episodes in the spring of each year. So tune in for anything you might have missed. You can also explore the video archive of our speaker events and webinars on the school's YouTube channel and on our ASU website, including all of the lecture and dialogue events in the CDP from 2017 onward. Now, our school has worked for 7 years to convene a high-level conversation in the Civic Discourse Project with single speakers, dialogue events, 2 speakers coming and exchanging ideas back and forth, and an annual conference this most recently last February, that together encompass a range of academic and civic views. The intellectual diversity we feature tries to exemplify civil disagreement, civil discourse, and also argues for its importance in higher education and in American society. We don't just teach civics, we try to practice civics. The public project is an extension of the school's academic program. Our courses, our curriculum, degrees, and student experiences that strive to reconnect liberal arts education and American civic education. Now, I should give you a quick preview of some coming events. Our last CDP program for the spring is with Alan Gelzo from Princeton University, from the James Madison program at Princeton. He's a leading Lincoln scholar, Lincoln historian, and he will be speaking on what the Civil War was really about. He will be joining us on April 4th, just a couple of weeks. Now, tomorrow, on Friday, March 22nd, former Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott will speak on China and Indo-Pacific security. That'll be 2 p.m. tomorrow. Check out our website here at ASU for more information and details. But now for the main event for today's event. Our speaker, Roosevelt Monta, grew up in the Dominican Republic until at 12 years old he moved to New York City, bright lights, big city. And he discovered the classics age 16 after rescuing a copy of Socrates from a neighbor's trash. From there, he went on to study at Columbia, where he is now senior lecturer in American Studies and English. His book, Rescuing Socrates, How the Great Books Changed My Life and Why They Matter for a New Generation, details his experiences as a student and as a teacher, telling the story of how great books transformed his life and why they have the power to speak to people of all backgrounds. I'm delighted then to welcome today Roosevelt Monta.
Thank you so much. It's quite a thrill for me to be here today. I've long admired what you do here and have wished to get in on it somehow. So I'm very, very happy to be here. Honored, really, and for this honor, I'm especially thankful to William Anthony Hay, who has guided my steps here today, and to Janelle Nassieff. I don't know if she's here, but she coordinated everything about my visit with what I take is her usual flawlessness. I am here to talk about themes that I develop in my book, a book I published in late 2021 titled Rescuing Socrates, How the Great Books Changed My Life and Why They Matter for a New Generation. That book is part memoir, part discussion of some important books and figures in the history of Western thought, and part a critique of the state of liberal education in American colleges and universities. But the real subject of that book is liberal education. And that is also my real subject tonight. I hope that you will bear with me in my treatment of the subject of liberal education as I undertake some fairly personal reflections and how a liberal education has played out in my own life. This is a subject of perennial importance, liberal education. Ever since people have been conscious of their freedom, they have wondered about what kind of education is most appropriate for people who are free. Freedom, it turns out, involves not just the absence of constraints, but the activity of self-governance. And self-governance at either the individual or the collective level is a tricky thing. It's not a straightforward task at all. It, in fact, requires a very particular kind of cultivation, a kind of tending that is concerned less with the transmission of facts than with cultivating specific qualities in an individual. We bundle together institutions we call colleges and universities, a kind of education that is concerned with the transmission of information and skills, and also a kind of education that is concerned with the cultivation of free individuals. This bundling together of those two kinds of education has led to a kind of conceptual confusion about the premises and aims of liberal education. The general debility of liberal education in our institutions of higher learning is in part the result of this conflation. Even though, as I have said, liberal education is a topic of enduring and persistent importance, the current moment makes the issue especially urgent. Our political culture is faltering, and it is fracturing precisely along the lines that liberal education is meant to address. At the same time, colleges and universities are walking away from liberal education, diluting it, shunting it to the side. The moral deformation in our politics is of a piece with the university's neglect of its mission to educate students with a view to what it means to live a life of freedom. To speak about liberal education, one has to speak of freedom. This is one of the reasons that I prefer the term liberal education to some of its cousins, like the humanities or classical education, or even civic education. The word liberal, despite its unfortunate association with one of the sides of our fierce political divide, keeps the issue of human freedom front and center. You all probably know that the idea of liberal education goes back to the ancient slave democracy of Athens. There, liberal education was conceived as that education that was appropriate for free citizens. That is, people who were not slaves. People whose status as citizens of a democracy involved them in the tasks of collective self-governance. Tasks like holding political office, formulating and deliberating on the adoption of laws, sitting on juries, serving in the common defense of the city, etc. These tasks of self-governance involve a whole range of knowledge and skills, some of them quite concrete and specific, but some of them having to do with qualities of character, with broad-mindedness, intellectual curiosity, tolerance for difference, courage, capacity to subordinate narrow self-interest for the benefit of the whole, etc. To this day, democracies depend on a citizenry capable of discharging the civic duties for which a liberal education prepared Athenian citizens. Indeed, the possibility of democracy hinges on the success or failure of liberal education and of its being not just an education for the elite, but an education for the demos, for the people at large. So to talk about liberal education is necessarily to talk about freedom and to talk about self-governance. And when self-governance refers not just to freedom at the individual level, but to freedom at the collective level, then we're necessarily talking about citizenship. And in this sense, liberal education is synonymous with civic education. Seeing how I am here at the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership, I'd like to foreground this aspect of liberal education, the civic aspect, and think a little bit about how it connects to democracy. Among the many things that connect these two practices of democracy and of liberal education is that by their very essence, these practices negate any claim to special expertise or authority in regard to them. Democracy means that we have equal authority and equal say in matters of our collective destiny. We have this equality by virtue of having entered as free agents into a democratic form of association. Liberal education similarly presupposes our condition as free and independent agents, individuals who can think for themselves, who can form their own judgments about the most important questions. So nothing I say today stands on the authority of my expertise, but rather on the ground that I inhabit in common with everyone else that's listening to me. I've already said some things about the state of liberal education today and will say more. But let me also say something about our democracy. If we are justifiably worried about the state of liberal education in our colleges and universities, we're probably even more worried about the state of our democracy. I don't think I exaggerate when I say that a sense of political and spiritual crisis hangs in the air. Whatever your political affiliations, in November 2016, with the election of Donald Trump as President of the United States, the nation experienced a tremor that went down to its core. Since then, fault lines in our political culture that had been widening for years have become open gashes. One salient feature of the atmosphere of crisis under which we find ourselves is a corrosive lack of public trust in the institutions that have served as traditional arbiters of fact and truth. A crisis of credibility, undermining what used to be the broadly accepted sources of reliable information. The government and its agencies, the media, academia, the courts, even the scientific establishment seem to be losing the trust of large segments of the public. What we're facing is not your garden variety case of political polarization. Polarization runs through American history like a pulse. It is the lifeblood of democratic politics. But what we're facing today is a different kind of thing, a kind of epistemic breakdown. As a political community, we seem to be losing our hold on a shared reality. The premises and the basis from which we would work to resolve our differences, negotiate conflicts, work through the problems of self-governance seem to be giving out from under us. We cannot blame academia for this, but nor can we ignore that as a society, we have failed to educate a population capable of metabolizing the flood of information and disinformation to which the digital revolution has subjected us. The explosion in information technology and the means of communication is forcing change upon us relentlessly and vertiginously. Every day, more and more aspects of our lives are served up to us by profit-maximizing algorithms, obeying a logic that is blind to and often enough destructive of our notion of the common good. In short, the information environment in which we live has thrown civic challenges before us that we are not meeting. The discursive strength of our social fabric is being tested and is being found wanting. As I said, we cannot blame academia for this, but we cannot congratulate ourselves either. General education in our colleges and universities is, for the most part, inadequate to the moment. It fails to equip students with the critical discursive capacities, with the historical perspectives, with the character formation that our moment demands. It is part of the job of colleges and universities, the part of their job that lies in the purview of liberal education, to grow the connective tissue, the discursive infrastructure that makes a shared project of self-governance possible. American higher education has excelled at its knowledge-producing function, and this undergirds American preeminence in science, technology, and innovation. But American higher education has fallen short in its citizen-producing function. It has excelled at technical education, but fallen short at liberal education. This is the portion of the social problem that we in higher education own. When I applied to college, I had no idea what a liberal education was. I had the fortune of ending up at the one major research university that has a required grade books liberal arts curriculum, required of all of its students regardless of their major. It's called the core curriculum and takes up most of the first 2 years of study at Columbia College. The way in which that intellectual experience expanded and transformed my inner life drives much of what I do to this day. My 2021 books, Rescuing Socrates, How the Great Books Changed My Life and Why They Matter for a New Generation, as that title suggests, it's a reflection on the role that liberal education has played in my life. But its deeper concern is about the imperative today for colleges and universities to take seriously their mission of educating students liberally, especially those students who come from what we call marginalized communities, people who have not had the resources, opportunities, and privileges that most people who attend college have had. By the time I started writing the book, I had spent 10 years as director of Columbia University's Center for the Core Curriculum. Even though I always recognized that the value of liberal education is rooted in a subjective and personal experience, throughout my time as director of the Columbia Core Curriculum, I avoided making the case for liberal education with reference to my own life story. Like many immigrants, I harbor a profound distaste for the stereotypes associated with the immigrant story. You know, the cardboard cutouts featuring the rise from poverty and marginality through hard work and education. It's not that these things aren't true about me, but that I have refused to turn those aspects of my life into an identity. I did not want my case for liberal education to be about my story. Yet the experience of liberal education is inescapably personal, subjective, specific. So I knew that I could only write a book about liberal education in the first person and with my entire self in it. So the case I make for liberal education in the book synthesizes insights I had developed over the course of my academic career with an honest examination of my inner and outer life and how it has been shaped by my liberal education. This is what Rescuing Socrates is about. With your indulgence, let me place some autobiographical details before you. I grew up in a small rural town in the Dominican Republic and came to the United States not speaking English 2 days before my 12th birthday. When I was a child, my little mountain town was still immersed in the agrarian and pre-industrial rhythms of the 19th century. It extended 6 streets in one direction and 4 streets in the other direction. My childhood address, Calle 6, Casa 7, the 6th house on the 7th Street. I remember when roads were paved in my town. I remember when we got running water. I grew up without a television, without a stove, without a refrigerator, without a phone. Sometimes I say that I was raised in the 19th century. If you had never met anyone raised in the 19th century, here's one. And the people, the grown-ups around me, were raised in the 18th century. So there is considerable distance, not measurable in miles, between the world in which I lived until I was 12 and this podium. I landed in New York City in May of 1985. With me was my older brother. We went there to join our mother, who had emigrated 2 years earlier. In many ways, we were a typical Dominican family, poor, with no English, and with little knowledge of what life in the United States would entail. We knew enough to know that whatever it would be, it would have better opportunities for us than our life back in the Dominican Republic. My mother got a minimum wage job in a garment factory in Brooklyn, while my brother and I entered New York City's overcrowded public school system, where the free lunches supplied a good portion of our sustenance. When my mother lost her job, we could not pay the rent, and my brother and I moved to a basement room in a relative's house while Mom went on her own and fed for herself. We didn't live paycheck to paycheck since we didn't have jobs. We lived hand to mouth. I tell more of that story in the book, but my point here is simply that when I speak about how a liberal education can illuminate a life, how it can give people unique tools to navigate their inner and outer worlds and empower them to transform their reality, I speak from personal experience. Education, and liberal education in particular, has the power and the tendency to transform people's lives. But the way in which liberal education transforms people is quite distinctive. For one thing, it plays out in as many forms as there are individuals in the world, so that liberal education cannot have a predetermined outcome, which is why it cannot be used for ideological indoctrination. Everyone who does it knows that liberal education is a poor instrument for passing on pre-established truths, for taking students from where they are to a preconceived ideological destination. No, the kind of transformation liberal education promotes is something that is spawned from within yourself, not something that is given to you from the outside. Liberal education doesn't turn you into someone else, but it turns your eyes inward so that you can see more clearly who you actually are. That's why the kind of transformation achieved through liberal education is thoroughgoing. It is like walking through a thick fog. It soaks you through and through. Liberal education doesn't just add more knowledge on top of your previous stock. Liberal education rearranges everything else that you know. You don't just end up with more knowledge, you end up with a different configuration of knowledge. In other words, liberal knowledge alters the internal proportions of your soul. In liberal learning, there is no separation between what you know and who you are. And that's why it's transformative. Let me invoke this inner transformation as it began for one of my intellectual and political heroes, Frederick Douglass. I'm going to read to you a passage from his 1845 autobiography narrative of the life of an American slave. Now let me set this up for you. This passage comes when Frederick Douglass is around 9 years old. Frederick was born in a plantation in Maryland, in the Eastern Shore, backwoods, really out of the way of everything. And when he's about 9, his master, Thomas Auld, sends Frederick to live with his brother Thomas in Hugh Auld in Baltimore. So little Douglas is sent on a boat, on a sloop to Baltimore to join this family where there's another little boy, and the idea is that Frederick is going to serve as a household slave and as a companion to the little boy. This incident I'm going to read takes place just shortly after Douglas arrives in Baltimore. Very soon after I went to live with Mr. and Mrs. Ault, and let me make one other comment about this passage I'm going to read. This passage contains the N-word, that derogatory slur. It's in the mouth of the slave master, and it is used as an insult, just the way that it's used today. I'm not going to pronounce the word, I'm going to replace the word with slavery, and that's simply because that word has taken on such a high voltage in our culture that many people just find it indecent and offensive just to say it. There are other words like that in the English language that people find indecent to be said out loud in polite company. So I'm going to replace that slur with the word slave. I guarantee that you'll know where that word is because your American ear is trained to recognize it. So very soon after I went to live with Mr. and Mrs. Ault, she very kindly commenced to teach me the ABC. After I had learned this, she assisted me in learning to spell words of 3 or 4 letters. Just at this point in my progress, Mr. Ault found out what was going on and at once forbade Mrs. Ault to instruct me further, telling her, among other things, that it was unlawful as well as unsafe to teach a slave to read. To use his own words further, he said, if you give a slave an inch, he will take an L. A slave should know nothing but to obey his master, to do as he is told to do. Learning would spoil the best slave in the world. Now, said he, if you teach that slave, speaking of myself, how to read, there would be no keeping him. It would forever unfit him to be a slave. He would at once become unmanageable and of no value to his master. As to himself, it could do him no good, but a great deal of harm. It would make him discontented and unhappy. Douglas continues, these words sank deep into my heart, stirred up sentiments within that lay slumbering, and called into existence a new train of thought. It was a new and special revelation explaining dark and mysterious things with which my youthful understanding had struggled, but struggled in vain. I now understood what had been to me a most perplexing difficulty, to wit, the white man's power to enslave the black man. Let me make a little comment there. Little Douglas, at 9 years old, he's grown up in the plantation, surrounded by other black slaves. He knows them intimately. He knows they're not weaker, they're not dumber, they're not in any way inferior to the whites that he knows intimately too in the house. He sees them up close. He knows they're not smarter. He knows they're not stronger. He knows they're not in any way superior to the blacks. Yet what he sees is that all the black people are enslaved and all the white people are free. And the white people enslave the black people, and he can't figure out why this is or how this is. But hearing his enslaver issue the prohibition and name the consequences of learning to read, Douglas says, I get back to the quote, from that moment, I understood the pathway from slavery to freedom. It was just what I wanted, and I got it at a time when I least expected it. Whilst I was saddened by the thought of losing the aid of my kind mistress, I was gladdened by the invaluable instruction which by the merest accident I had gained from my master. Though conscious of the difficulty of learning to read without a teacher, I set out with high hope and a fixed purpose, at whatever cost of trouble, to learn to read. And boy, did he learn how to read and write, and made his name as a newspaper editor and orator, and one of the most important political writers in American history. Now, you might say today, there's no more slavery. Slavery is a thing of the past, outlawed by the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. Well, it's true that there is no longer in the U.S. chattel slavery, where you and your children are literally owned by someone else 24/7 and forever. But there are other forms of subjugation, coercion, and domination that pervade modern life and which have much in common with slavery. Liberal education, the kind of education into which Douglas saw a window in his acquisition of literacy, is today also aimed at charting a path from existing forms of slavery to freedom, at transforming you in such a way that you are forever unfit to be a slave. Let me point to two broad domains in which forms of subjugation persists in contemporary life, one public and one private. One pervasive form of domination that exists around us is what has traditionally been called wage slavery. That's when you sell your labor for a period of time and are, during that time, effectively subject to a master. In antiquity, this form of servitude was considered beneath the dignity of a free person. But it's almost taken for granted today that this is okay, that it's some kind of life to sell yourself to servitude from Monday to Friday in order to buy the privilege of living on the weekends. But actually, it's not okay. This is not the worthiest life for a human being. There is no virtue in that. There is no expression of human excellence, no recognition of human dignity. On the contrary, a degrading brutalization of human nature. So it's not education to prepare you for and convince you to live a life of quiet desperation, toiling at what Marx called alienated labor. It's not education to prepare you for and convince you to sell your humanity for wages, whether it's low wages or high wages. Where I live in New York, I know many high-earning wage slaves. This isn't to say that education shouldn't enable students to make a better living than they would without an education. It is to say that there is also a higher and more fundamental purpose to education. Education should also be about how to be free, about how to live the life of an autonomous moral agent, not just the life of a hired laborer. Education should be not only about how to make a living, but about how to compose a life. So that's one form of subjugation that exists today. There's another, even more pervasive kind of subjugation and slavery, and that is when one aspect of ourselves exerts tyrannical control over another. And here let me quote Jean-Jacques Rousseau from the Social Contract, where he says that to be driven by appetite alone is slavery, and obedience to the law one has prescribed for oneself is freedom. This even more pervasive aspect of servitude has to do with the contradictorily layered nature of our psyche. Freedom, is great. We love freedom. But it brings its own problems. As you no doubt remember, one of the shocks of college life is the challenge of self-governance. Many people who fail at college failed not for intellectual reasons, that the material they're asked to learn is just too hard for them. They fail because of failures in self-governance. How do we organize the tangle of psychic forces, conflicting desires, contradictory impulses that exist within our mortal frame? We want to be fit, but we don't want to work out. We want to play an instrument beautifully, but we don't want to practice. We want to lose weight, but we want to eat all the desserts. We desire these things genuinely, wholeheartedly, authentically. Our faculty for desiring knows nothing about logic and contradiction. I submit to you that the maximal possibilities for human freedom come from the optimal organization, from the more or less successful integration of our inner lives. Enabling this integration is the most profound way in which liberal education is liberating. Now, if you permit me, before I hit the final stretch of my remarks, I want to lay out 4 guideposts for designing the kinds of curricula and the kind of courses that can aspire to deliver the transformative sort of education I have been describing. I think of these as the 4 core commitments of liberal education courses. They are: first, small classes; second, a discussion format; 3, non-disciplinarity, and 4, commonality of intellectual experience. Let me say a word about each of these features. First, small classes. Small classes mean more expensive classes. There are, of course, hard financial constraints to the size of classes that an institution can offer, but naming this feature explicitly forces us to come to terms with the fact that liberal education is not cost-effective. In that way, it is like cooking a good meal, where the point is not to prepare the largest number of calories per unit of expense. In cooking faster and cheaper is not better. If cost and logistics were no issue, I would go by a rule formulated by the economist Norman McRae, who championed the power of small groups to think together. How small a group? He was asked. Jesus Christ tried 12, he answered, and that proved one too many. At Columbia, the maximum number per section in the core curriculum class is 22 students, which in my view is a bit too large, but workable. Feature 2 has to do with discussion. The reason for small groups is so that courses can be offered as conversations rather than as lectures. The liberal arts professor does not present him or herself as an expert, as a master of the subject with a repository of knowledge that he or she will dispense to the student. Rather, the teacher is a guide to discussion, almost like the conductor of an orchestra, pushing a bit harder here, highlighting that important bit there, pressing for clarity and rigor here, and where appropriate, offering context and clarification. It is in no way a passive role, but an active one that relies on reservoirs of specialized knowledge and pedagogical skill, but whose object isn't the reproduction of that specialized knowledge. It is the students' voices, their contributions, their evolution that makes the class. Feature 3 is non-disciplinarity. There is a debilitating misconception in general education that a liberal arts education consists in exposure to the liberal arts disciplines. True liberal arts courses are pre-disciplinary or even meta-disciplinary. They inhabit the human questions from which the disciplines arise, questions that matter and are relevant to students quite independently of their disciplinary elaborations. To put it bluntly, liberal education has nothing to do with majoring in the liberal arts or with competence in the academic liberal arts disciplines. The engineer, the banker, the scientist, the computer scientist, the businessman need liberal education as much as the scholar, the humanist, the painter. They all need it the same. They should all get it the same. The fourth feature is commonality of intellectual experience, and this is probably the most neglected aspect of liberal education. Colleges have largely withdrawn from the task of offering students a considered view of just what aspects of our intellectual and cultural heritage are most worth their attention. Presenting, if always provisionally, a common body of provocations, debates, and questions as deserving the attention of every undergraduate at a given institution is a basic responsibility of a college faculty. Believe me, I am aware of how difficult this is. But the problem is that we have stopped trying, shifting all of the energy to content-free learning goals. But we owe students an account, even if a provisional account, of what, in our view, are the essential things they should encounter as part of their general education. So you might think about these four commitments of liberal education: small classes, discussion format, non-disciplinarity, commonality of intellectual experience, as commitments relating to form. Those commitments do not specify anything about the content of a liberal education. But I do want to say a few things about content. As almost everyone who has experienced it will confirm, A liberal education based on the study of works of major cultural and historical significance confers an inexhaustible treasure that you carry with you for the rest of your life. There are, of course, far more works of this type than can be included in any curriculum, so judicious selection sensitive to contemporary context and concerns must still be made. But in all cases, works that grapple with the core questions of politics, religion, and philosophy that have shaped our world deserve prominence in liberal education curricula. The aim of such an education is not to provide answers to these fundamental questions, but to bring them alive for the student, to instill habits of reflections and inquiry that can serve as guides to life. And one last thing about content. When thinking about liberal education through core texts, one often hears the concern that when students arrive at college, they should be exposed to works that affirm their identity, works in which they can, quote unquote, see themselves. This strikes me as a correct intuition. But we have to guard against too narrow a conception of what sorts of identities our students bring with them and what aspects of it we should affirm. This is especially important when we think about first-generation and low-income students. I speak from my own experience as one such student and from years of work introducing low-income students to foundational texts. It is simply not true that such students can't see themselves in Macbeth's lust for power or in Raskolnikov's inner turmoil. First-generation students, low-income students, students from marginalized backgrounds, like all other students, are perfectly capable of seeing themselves in Socrates' defense of the search for truth before an Athenian jury, in Don Quixote's idealism, in the human frailty of Montaigne. And it is just as important that they see themselves in the universality of human experience as it is that they see their individual particularity affirmed in the curriculum. In the contemporary academy, we tend to err in the direction of affirming particularity. This is usually motivated by a desire to reach our needy students where they are, but it is also often accompanied by a kind of intellectual condescension that does more harm to our students than good. It's a paternalistic critique of the canon that insists that Homer, Sophocles, Plato, Goethe, Hegel, Dostoevsky, Woolf, etc. are not for people like me, that they are for white people or rich people or people born with class privileges that I lacked. The claim that in today's America there is no sufficiently shared intellectual and cultural heritage to justify common study is belied by the fact that public life is transacted through a range of shared institutions, norms, categories, and values in which we all participate and in which we all have a stake. These institutions, norms, categories, and values have a history which, though riddled with debate, constitutes our shared heritage. My being a brown immigrant from the Dominican Republic does not make the Constitution or Shakespeare or Dante any less relevant to me than they are to my wife, a white woman from Michigan. And to suggest so does me and my education no favors. I never know how to end the talk, so I'll just end here abruptly by expressing my thanks for your exemplary attentiveness tonight.
Should a liberal education make us feel uncomfortable? I ask that in the context of so many state legislatures passing laws saying that students should not be made uncomfortable to learn of things.
Yeah. Yes, I think a liberal education is and should be profoundly disturbing. In a final exam, a student of mine a few years ago, a Chinese immigrant student, wrote, "The greatest lesson I have learned from this class is that inquiry is fatal to certainty. And I often find that some of my students come at the end of class and saying, you know, I walked in here having a pretty firm sense of how things work, sort of a pretty certain sense of what I thought. And now I'm living in utter confusion. Thank you. But yes, a liberal education is liberal, in part because it confronts us with the deepest questions, and it has the capacity, and I think the tendency to unsettle you. And it should do that. It should make you uncomfortable. It should disturb you. It should confront you with aspects of yourself and realities about your life and our society that you may not want to see, that you may have been avoiding all of your life. The idea, you know, that students ought to be protected from those kinds of challenges, the idea that those kinds of challenges are harmful, that constitutes harm for a student, I think it's misguided, and it will produce the opposite of education. Growth is an activity that requires a kind of stretching, a kind of pulling, a kind of moving you into discomfort, confronting you with the uncomfortable that is inevitable. Now, there are, of course, forms of sort of abusive treatment that can happen not just in the classroom, can happen anywhere. And you can there are instances like that happen in classrooms and that happen in higher education, but higher education is not a commonplace for that. It's not a problem that I think we need to legislate and get worked up about. It can be dealt with in individual circumstances. And there are students who have had sort of the kinds of traumatic experiences that means that they would find certain conversations deeply unsettling or unsettling in such a way that I'm describing post-traumatic stress syndrome, and that's a real thing, right? But the reality of that has been abused and sort of, in my view, kind of disrespected by just saying things that I don't like to hear, things that I find challenging, things that question, interrogate beliefs that I hold dear. That exposing myself to that is the word used, triggering, the word that I think is just kind of disrespects the actual psychological condition that some people, because of very deeply traumatic circumstances, find themselves in. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Just pull this. Thinking back to when you mentioned the types of slavery that still are in effect today, wage slavery, and I forget the other one right now, and then thinking about Frederick Douglass, do you think there's different types of freedom? Is it possible to be in a position where you would consider yourself a wage slave, but you can still be free because of the education you've received or give yourself? Was Frederick Douglass free in some ways before he was freed physically?
Yeah, great, thank you. That's an excellent question. There's a famous episode in Douglass. So Douglass, after he learns this, he proceeds to a program of self-education. He learns to read in part by getting lessons from other children that he plays with, white children that go to school. He gets them to teach him give him some sort of tutoring. He buys lessons from them. He at around age 11 or 12 walks into a bookstore and buys a book called The Columbian Orator, which is a common textbook in 19th century education. That's a compendium of speeches about kind of freedom and patriotism. He buys this book. This book is, as I said, a common textbook. He must have understood that this is the book that kids were studying in school. So he goes and buys it. I can just imagine, right, the bookseller. Here comes this little 11 or 12-year-old black boy who's a slave with 50 cents or whatever it is, and he wants to buy the Colombian Orator. Like, anyway, he buys it. Douglass teaches himself to read. He reads everything. He hears, he hears people, slaveholders, raging against abolition and abolitionists, and he doesn't know what that is, but he wants to find out. He goes, looks in the dictionary, abolition, and the definition the dictionary gives him for abolition is the act of abolishing. It's like, great, thanks. But eventually he figures out what it is. He reads. He gets sent back to the Eastern Shore, and there he starts teaching his fellow slaves to read. He gets busted for doing that. Eventually he hatches a plan of escape where he literally writes out passes for himself and for a group of slaves, and they're going to have a plan. They hatch it, they plan it, they schedule it, and one of them gets cold feet and spills the beans. So the plan is broken up, and Douglass is sent to a slave breaker. A slave breaker was somebody who specialized in psychological and physical torture to the extent of breaking the will of slaves who showed any inkling of desire to leave. And Douglass says, I went there and it worked. This man, Covey was his name, broke my will, dehumanized me, brutalized it. I was more like a beast. I was more like a brute than I was like a human. And there came one day where Douglass got sick, couldn't do work, and Covey tried to beat him. And Douglass, a kind of almost animal resistance emerges, and Douglass fights the slaveholder, fights him to a draw. Douglass does not beat him. All he does is he fights defensively. He prevents him from beating Douglass. He draws blood. In the middle of the fight lasts like an hour or more. In the middle of the fight, the slave owner tries to get some of the other slaves to come and help him, and they refuse. Douglass says, that day there was a general uprising. And Douglass said that that was the last time that he was beaten. Douglass said, after that time, I realized that I would never be whipped again. I would be killed, maybe. I might be killed, but I will not going to get whipped. And he talks about that, standing up to Covey and asserting, he uses sort of gendered language, his manhood. He said that from that moment he began to be free. He said, from that moment I could be a slave externally, but I could never be a slave internally anymore. So sorry for the long story, but you asked specifically, and Douglass does give that specific answer, that he attained a kind of inner liberation before it came to the outside. Slavery, he says, Hegel has his famous master-slave dialectic. You hear people, the master-slave dialectic, but one of the things that Hegel's theorization of the master-slave dialectic is that the relationship of master and slave requires the recognition of the slave, the acceptance and recognition. It is the slave's recognition of the condition that establishes the dynamic. If the slave does not recognize the condition, does not accept and recognize the master as master, you can't have the master. So it's a mutually constitutive relationship. Now, turning that to the contemporary moment, wage slavery is the norm in our society in some form. That is, we live in a capitalist society. There isn't a leisured property class that lives without labor, as opposed to kind of the laboring class. We live in the reign of the middle class where obviously there are exceptions, but the brunt of our society, of our culture, of our capitalist economy is that people will work for a living. People will work to generate their income. So in some sense, there is this kind of wage slavery. Nearly all of us sell our labor in one way or another. And to that extent, it is wage labor. But then there are differences there. That is, there is a kind of labor, and some of us here, especially I think those of us in academia, have a privilege where we labor in a way that is remarkably free. We have a contract with our institutions where we would we perform certain duties and get a certain salary, but there's a tremendous amount of autonomy. That's one profession that is just uniquely privileged in our society. There are others that recognizes our freedom. But there are different degrees, and then there's the kind of wage labor where you're asked to compromise and shelve your moral autonomy and to do work in which you do not have a say, do not have a right, do not have a moral standing. You just do what you are told to do or you're commanded. And some of these are very high paying. Some of these are very high paying jobs. That form, I think, is as dehumanizing as any form of wage slavery, regardless of how much it pays. So I do think that liberal education today somehow unfits you for that kind of morally compromised, dignity compromising type of wage slavery. That it equips you both with the flexibility and the tools to create sustainable modes of living, but that it also makes you averse to subjecting yourself to that kind of life. One other thing I want to say about this is that there are forms of like very manual and physical and demanding sort of productive labor that are not wage slavery if they express your sort of dignity, your creativity, your humanity. When you are not alienated, and this is a Marxist concept, when you're not alienated from the labor. That is, two people can be doing the same exact job. One of them is alienated for the labor. That labor is mortifying. That labor is external. That labor is coercive, and sort of does it under coercion. And someone else can be doing that same labor as an expression of something that they love doing, that they feel an ownership with, that they don't feel oppressed by. And it can be the same labor. So, and that has to do with just an internal disposition, but also the conditions under which you do it. Who owns what's being done, for example. Anyway, I think that liberal education today equips you and equips our students to find ways of living, of making a living that are not enslaving.
Thank you, sir, for being here tonight. My question is regarding liberal education. I think that there may be a criticism that liberal education is inaccessible or perhaps even elitist. And so my question to you is, you say that liberal education is for the whole of humanity to help us become more human, flourishing human beings, but at the same time it has to remain small and conversational. So what would be your advice for an institution such as scetl going forward to fill that human need for liberal education while retaining what makes it transformative?
Yeah, great, thank you. Liberal education has an accurate historical association with elitism. That is, with exclusivity, with it being only accessible and a marker of privilege, inherited privilege. I mean, only such people used to go to college. A liberal education was only accessible for a long time in the original languages. So if you wanted to read those texts and be able to quote Plato or Aristotle or Augustine, you had to learn Greek and Latin. So it was for a long time a marker of class, a marker of privilege, and accessible only to the privileged. One of the historical achievements of America has been this idea of democratizing college, this idea of opening up higher education, not just to the privileged elite, not just to an aristocracy, but to the masses, to the demos. I think it is a kind of an idea that captures something fundamental about America, what America is about. But today, the practice still carries that sort of aroma of elitism, and many people think that it is that it is elitist. Now, there are two ways in which we can understand elitism. So one is a form of exclusion, a form of marginalization, a form of denying certain people access to certain things. That's elitism, and that's the kind of elitism we don't like. There's another kind of elitism that has to do with preference and recognition of that which is best, right? And sometimes we use that word to refer to like an elite athlete, right? An elite athlete is just the the best, the most accomplished, the most skilled kind of athlete. Or we might speak of an elite military unit that has the best trained and the most effective soldiers. So that form of elitism simply recognizes excellence, right? And the word is originally of the same root as excellent, as a synonym for excellent. So in that way, when you understand elitism as a recognition and a reaching for that which is best, that which is excellent, that which expresses what the Greeks called virtue, then liberal education is about that. Yeah, liberal education teaches you the kind of discrimination. It teaches you and equips you to reach for the good, to reach for the excellent, to become, in fact, excellent. It builds your capacity to recognize and equips you to achieve a kind of human excellence. So in that sense, it is elitist. It should not be understood and it should not be elitist in the sense of excluding people and making it accessible only to the privileged. I don't know the curriculum as scetl well enough to comment on it, but what I would say is that the characteristics that I described, small classes, commonality, non-disciplinarity, discussion base, that these characteristics, when implemented in a curriculum, give you the best format, the best configuration in which to make the kind of liberal education I'm describing possible. I know enough to know that the curriculum here focuses on the kinds of work and the kinds of discussions that lead to this thinking. So you're probably in one of the better places that there are in higher education to pursue a real liberal education at this school.
Thank you so much for your lecture. I was wondering, for those of us who are either past our undergrad or past academia, or maybe didn't get the chance to have a liberal education in an academic setting, beyond just reading, what we would describe as great books, are there other recommendations for kind of a personalized journey for someone to get a liberal education, either to build on one they already have or to get one that they maybe didn't get before?
Great, thank you for that question, which I think is very important. A liberal education is not something that ends. It's not, something that you graduate from and you have done it, you have completed it, now you can move on to do something else. A liberal education is a kind of ongoing way of living. It's an ongoing way of relating and absorbing the external world. So school is a good place to do it. I think if you have a university curriculum, it should be liberal. And I think if you wanted to organize a systematic, effective way of delivering liberal education, then a college curriculum of the kind I've been describing is a great way to do it. But it's not the only way of doing it. There are a couple of things that I think are fundamental to liberal education. One is encounter with, in academia we throw around the term great books, right? But encounter with works of human creativity and exploration that are profound, that are meaningful, that have productively encountered the fundamental questions that we all as human beings face. Sometimes this is art, sometimes it's books, sometimes it's music, sometimes it's a film, sometimes it's an exhibit, sometimes it's a news feature, an essay. So there are lots of ways. So encountering, bringing yourself into close, serious engagement with great works is one ingredient. Another ingredient is to do that in conversation. I guess it's possible for you to get a liberal education all by yourself. And you hear people, Malcolm X reads everything in the library and you hear examples of people who sort of do it on their own. But I think that liberal education requires conversation. That liberal education is a thing that happens between people. So in addition to exposing yourself to great works in whatever form you do, that you do so in conversation and in analysis, in debate, in examination with others, with small groups of people. One thing about having that disposition is that it makes the world teeming with interest and stimulation and sort of intellectual excitement. We live in such an incredibly rich environment of ideas, of information, of sort of mind expanding opportunities to encounter great stuff, whether it's art, whether it's theater, whether it's television, whether it's books, literature. You turn on the TV and you find stuff like that. So engaging with the world with this approach of liberal learning and liberal education, I think just deepens and makes the world so incredibly fascinating and interesting. And it's one of the great gifts that I think we give our students, is that we send them out with this capacity to engage with the reality as it unfolds in this lively, engaged, interesting way. It's like the greatest soap opera. It's one of, I swear, I'm incredibly gripped by politics. I read and think and pay attention to contemporary politics. And I swear part of it is just the soap opera aspect of it. Part of it is that it's just incredibly kind of like the human drama of it is so compelling. Yeah.
Hi. So I've noticed in the contemporary context, I see a liberal education being paired at and almost being a marriage with civic education.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to know what your views are and if you put any stock or weight on patriotism, love of country, and civil responsibility as
Mm-hmm.
a means of accelerating a liberal education.
Yeah, okay, great. It's a great question. I think that liberal education and civic education are intimately connected. That is, that liberal education is about how we live a life of freedom, both individually and collectively. So when you think about it, when you think of the collective aspect of liberal education, that liberal education prepares you, gives you the tools through which you can effectively participate in a collective endeavor of self-governance. Participating in collective self-governance requires a bunch of sort of discursive skills, capacity to argue, to listen, to absorb information, to triangulate between views, to compromise. A lot of sort of discursive and character dispositions are required to meaningfully, effectively participate in self-governance. That's civic education. It's civic education at the most profound level. Patriotism, I think that gets quite tricky because liberal education cannot be delivered in the service of a ideological outcome. It's like, can you do liberal education to turn people into better Christians? I'm not sure that you can. That is, I'm not sure that if you have already pre-established what a good Christian is and you're going to use liberal education to get them there, that you can do that. Patriotism is not a perfect parallel because there is something. What do we mean by patriotism, right? If it means recognition that your constitution and your political community is valuable and that your contribution to that political community is part of a flourishing and meaningful life, that you are committed to sort of making this political community thrive and feeding it. That, I think that is, if you think of patriotism that way, as what it takes to create a flourishing community. What Aristotle has this famous line in the Politics that we come together for the sake of survival, but stay together for the sake of living well. If you think of patriotism as a commitment to this collective form of thriving, of living well, then absolutely I think a liberal education equips you for that. But there are other narrower, nationalistic, identitarian, particularist form of patriotism that says, we're better than you, and we have a right to assert our interests above yours because they are national interests. Then that form of patriotism, I think, bleeds into something that's not liberal education. But it's tricky. Yeah.
Thank you. I have another question kind of about the political or broader social reception of liberal education. We live in this society that's has so much division of labor and need for expertise and professionalism, very specialized knowledges, and much of the research university builds people towards that specific expertise, and that then they get to lord over others, and that's their ticket to making their million or whatever. So do you see the liberal arts as countercultural in that it's preparing humans to go out into the world and not kind of bow their knee to an expert, or is there not really that kind of a conflict?
I think there is a kind of conflict. And I do think that liberal education is a countercultural practice in our society. The prevailing values in our culture are materialists, consumerists, individualists. And there is something about liberal education that puts all of those on question. What is a life really worth living? What is really worth striving for? Our culture offers you answers, straightforward answers to this question. What is worth striving for is power, wealth, fame, physical comfort. Those are sort of baseline. This is what the society offers you. Liberal education takes you to instill skepticism about those answers. It instills it inspires you to challenge and question whether those are actually the goods that are most worthwhile pursuing for you. And you may well discover that the way to attain a higher good, a more meaningful life, is to eschew many opportunities and many forms from which to attain power and wealth and comfort and notoriety. So I think liberal education is countercultural like that. There is just as I'm speaking, this phrase from the New Testament keeps coming to mind, where Jesus says you cannot serve God and mammon. Right? Mammon is riches. You cannot serve God and riches. That is, you cannot have your ultimate good, the thing to which you subject your own sort of the highest law, the highest goal, the highest organizing principle to which you subject yourself. That cannot be mammon and God. That cannot be the highest good and wealth and power and riches. And it's a binary. You're either out to attain the highest good, God, or you're either out to attain this particular kind of good that has to do with your own advancement, with your own empowerment, with your own comfort and security. And you can't do both. And I think liberal education is always asking you to look at the highest good, to ask yourself, what is the highest good and how do I attain it? So in that sense, I do think that there is a fundamental conflict. But I do want to emphasize that liberal education it does not give you the answer of what your highest good is. It just equips you to ask that question and to ask it in a better way and to work out better answers for yourself. What is the right mix? There's nothing wrong with making money. Making money, I think, is very good, and you can do a lot of good by making money. You can obviously do a lot of harm too, but making money is not a problem. What is the right mix? What is the right formula for each individual to strive for financial security, to strive to ensure that your children and your family is well resourced to attain their maximum potential? What is the balance between that and betraying the highest good in order to go after those material goods? Again, liberal education is not going to give you the answer, but I think it's going to equip you to work that very tricky and always individually idiosyncratic formula out better. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your remarks. Since you emphasize the connection between liberal education, liberal arts education, and civic education, I wonder if you would comment on the book that was published a couple of years ago by the current president of Johns Hopkins, Ronald Daniels, What Universities Owe Democracy.
Yeah.
And he makes the claim that every university and college in the United States, private or public, owes at least this piece of a liberal arts education to every student, every graduate.
Yeah.
And that is the civic education
Yeah.
piece. Not quite the phrasing that he uses,
Right.
democracy education,
Right.
something like that.
Right.
But all the benefits that universities and colleges, public or private, receive from being in this free, prosperous political culture, it's the minimum owed to every student. So
Yeah.
I can appreciate the view you're offering that a liberal education ought to be offered as an elective option, so to speak, an opportunity in the whole range of higher education, universities and colleges. But what do you make of his claim that it's the minimum to
Yeah.
be required,
Yeah.
at least a piece of it, to be
Yeah.
required of every student,
Yeah.
every college, every university?
I absolutely agree with Daniel's position. And I like to make a distinction between a liberal education and a liberal arts major, kind of alluded to it here, because so many people think that a liberal education consists in a liberal arts major, and that a liberal education should be one among the several options that you take. But no, a liberal education should be the foundation of every education. I came, sort of my intellectual formation happens at Columbia, and it's kind of a miracle that Columbia has the structure that it does. And it's a holdover from a different age. The core curriculum at Columbia was founded in 1919, in part as a response to the First World War. It started as a course required of all students called War Issues, which examined the causes and what was at stake in the First World War. And then that course evolved fairly quickly, right after as the war ends. It evolves into this general education course that is based on the study of primary texts in common for all the students. So every student takes the core curriculum, no matter the major, no matter the professional aspiration, the pre-med, the pre-engineering, the pre-law, the person interested in business, the person interested in art, everybody takes it. I do believe that it is a fundamental responsibility, so I agree with Daniels, that it's a fundamental responsibility of the university to give a liberal education to every student, that it needs to be a required, compulsory part of the curriculum. And a lot of universities do that by simply saying, okay, every student has to take 3 courses in the humanities and 4 in the social sciences and 1 in the quantitative sciences and 1 writing class and 1 in some field other than their major. And that's it. That's liberal education. That is not liberal education. Liberal education is deliberate, it's intentional, it is constructed with particular non-disciplinary aims in mind. Right? When you teach a liberal education course, you're not just reproducing your professional expertise, you're cultivating individuals, right? I'm not just reproducing my, American intellectual historian knowledge bank into my students. I'm not doing that when I'm teaching liberal education, because I'm not teaching future American intellectual historians. Some of them might become that, but I'm teaching all kinds of students, and I'm giving them what they will need as human beings to fully develop their capacities in whatever field they are. So I do think that higher education has gone profoundly astray by moving away from a common liberal art basis for all undergraduate education. And I do think it is a moral responsibility to our society and to our students to provide that. And I do think it is the faculty's responsibility to present to the student some account of a hierarchy of knowledge, some account of these are things that every individual at this institution should handle, should be familiar with, should grapple with. In a meeting I was this morning, somebody invoked Mortimer Adler, and I think it was Mortimer Adler who had some phrase that went something like, the best education, I think it was Adler, the best education for the best students is the best education for all the students. Often, liberal education today exists like in honors colleges or in honors programs. It should really be the common education for everybody. Again, not instead a practical education, not instead of a marketable education, not instead of a technical education, as the foundation for all of those other kinds of education. Yeah. All right. Thank you so much for your attention.